one of the facts which I've heard basically, which still strikes me, is one where the wife was basically saying that my husband doesn't put up the toilet seat after the use every time. And even after, reminding him on countless occasions, he would still do that, and she feels that, he's very inconsiderate. Of course, I think the caveat is that was not the only fact which was relied on for divorce, but that was one of the reasons which were given,
but it's
arguments.
not grounds for divorce.
In and of itself, it's not grounds for divorce, right? But like I said, when you take it
a lot
as
of people will
totality,
be divorced.
that's right.
Hi everyone, I'm Shulin, here to inspire you on the infinite possibilities after the bar. So this is a podcast where I speak with lawyers and former lawyers with a broad range of experiences, different backgrounds, different walks of life, people who've achieved incredible things. And today I'm really excited because we have a leading family and divorce lawyer with us, Ivan Cheong. So he's here to talk about how he stays inspired to help people navigate troubled marriages. He's also going to share his views on the repeal of Section 377A and what is his definition of success. So Ivan is a family law specialist with Withers Carter Wong. He has over a decade of experience in all areas of family law, including contentious divorces, disputes over child custody, relocation of children, maintenance, division of matrimonial assets, and unfortunately, family violence. So he's won countless accolades and was listed as one of Singapore's top most influential lawyers aged 40 and under, not too long ago. So welcome, Ivan, to the podcast. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Shulin.
So despite your youthful good looks, you now have more than 15 years of experience as a divorce lawyer, right?
Yes.
And in all your years of practice, you have seen Singapore's divorce rates go up. In fact, it's very strange, but the number of finalised divorce proceedings fell by 8.7% in 2021. I believe it's a good side effect of COVID, I'm thinking.
It could be a good side effect of COVID. In fact, I think sometimes the question was like, during the lockdown and the pandemic, did it affect the number of cases I actually saw? And the short answer is, like I said, well, I don't have all the statistics in that sense, right? From anecdotal evidence as well as speaking to other family lawyers, we did see more inquiries with regards to people who are unhappy with regards to their marriage, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think there's an increase per se in the sense of the number of divorces which have just automatically gone up, right? Mm-hmm. Perhaps then the question which is sometimes always posed, right, would be, is it a cultural issue in that sense? I'm not sure. Is that something which is of concern?
Actually, the other question I was going to ask you is, because Singapore is reportedly always has one of the highest divorce rates in the world. So is it something about our culture or our society that contributes to that as opposed to other countries? I mean, it's probably good business for you.
Okay, we always like to caveat to say that, while we are family lawyers in that sense, it's not that we thrive of disputes in that sense, right? Although I can say that the same might be said of my litigation colleagues in large, right? But generally speaking, I don't think it's a sign of the culture in that sense. It's more an issue with regards to the sign of the times in that sense, right? There's less of a stigma in general with regards to divorce these days, right? And I think that the pandemic has also basically kind of triggered a change in outlook for a lot of people, in the sense that where they feel that, if they're not happy in a marriage or in a relationship, and they've made attempts actually to make it work, they're less inclined in that sense to just say, you know what, we're going to stay in an unhappy marriage just because, we are already married. So I think these are some of the various factors which have actually acted in combination. It's not so much a cultural thing. I think as a society, as a whole, right, Asian society, right, as much has been said to say that, we are still more conservative. And I think that is still true in general, right? But at the same time, you see people are opening up and it's less of a stigma.
So there's definitely less of a stigma for sure. However, I recently met with a friend who's recently divorced, and well, she feels that there is still a stigma. But I believe you're right in the sense, I guess people are less inclined to suck it up. If things are not working out, they're just gonna do something about it.
That's right. And I think when I'm saying that there's less of a stigma, it's not a case whereby there's no stigma at all. I mean, like if you compare maybe with, say, our parents' generation or like a couple of decades ago, right, where basically the idea of getting a divorce was viewed as something which was being very shameful, which shouldn't be the case in that sense, because like I said, while we all want happy marriages, happy relationships, the world is not perfect in that sense, right? And where marriages break down, where the relationship breaks down, and parties have tried for whatever reason to try and reconcile, but it doesn't work, what then is the next solution? And the next solution is then for parties to be able to move on with their lives with minimum animosity in that sense, and especially for the sake of the children, right? Because that has a huge impact on the children moving forward in terms of how parents decide to split up amicably and how they choose to conduct themselves during a divorce.
I'm sure you've seen your fair share, and we're going to hear more about those, whatever that you can share to the extent that you can share. So that brings me to the next question, because what are the most common causes of, a marriage breaking down? It does take two hands to clap. What are the most common causes? Or maybe you can also share what's the most unusual cause.
Yeah, so in terms of the most common causes, well, in Singapore in that sense, right, the only ground for divorce is still an irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. So there's nothing like irreconcilable differences. But if you're talking about common causes, right, it's usually parked under the category of what we call unreasonable behavior, right? Very common reasons which we always hear that constitutes clear unreasonable behaviors, like infidelity on the part of one or maybe both parties in that sense, right? If unfortunately there's physical violence, which is unfortunately something which is not uncommon, right? Or sometimes in that sense, parties feel that they're drifted apart. They don't feel that they're respected as an equal partner of the marriage. These are some of the very common reasons which we actually have, right? Sometimes also they feel that they're caught between their spouse and their in-laws, or they feel that they're not supported. And these are some of the general areas which might not in and of itself be sufficient, right, for a party to say, you know what, that's it, I want to get out of a marriage. But when taken in its totality, they all add up and they build up over time. And if parties don't communicate, which is also not uncommon in that sense, these things in that sense might be the triggers for divorce. Now, if you're talking, of course, I can't share specific details in that sense, but we're talking about what might be one of the more uncommon reasons which I've heard. I mean, one of the facts which I've heard basically, which still strikes me, is one where the wife was basically saying that my husband doesn't put up the toilet seat after they use every time. And even after, reminding him on countless occasions, he would still do that. And she feels that, he's very inconsiderate. Of course, I think the caveat is that was not the only fact which was relied on for divorce, but that was one of the reasons which were given, which to me was actually a bit more uncommon. But certainly among some of my friends, they're saying that, they always get that, kind of response
but it's not grounds for divorce.
In and of itself, it's not grounds for divorce, right? But like I said, when you take
a lot of people will be divorced.
That's right. That's true in that sense. But these are some of the more uncommon reasons in that sense, which are, are actually relied on in terms of unreasonable behavior, or like not feeding my dog at the allocated time. And you think about it like, it sounds very small, it sounds very trivial, but to people when they are in the midst of an unhappy marriage, and there are all these little things which add up, to them, that could be the final straw which broke the camel's back.
That's true. The toilet seat. Okay. Wow. Okay, so instead of going to you at the first instance, there is also alternative dispute resolution. But then again, you need a lawyer for that. So mediation, right? And you are a strong advocate for that. Can you tell us a bit more about mediation? It's become much more like a really successful way of resolving conflict.
That's right. So mediation basically in that sense, right? And also just to share very quickly in terms of the family justice ecosystem as a whole, right? There's something which has been talked about very recently, right? Lately by both the courts and even the government is kind of advocating it about therapeutic justice, right? So in a nutshell, right, they want to reduce the animosity of the judicial ecosystem such that, parties who are going for divorce don't, enter into very long protracted battles And mediation, in that sense, is one of the key aspects of one of alternative dispute resolutions. What is its benefit? The benefits are manifold, right? And that's why basically for couples who are divorcing and they have minor children who are basically under the age of 21, mediation is compulsory when they're actually going for divorce in that sense, right? So it is called child-focused compulsory mediation. And one of the benefits about mediation really is that parties are able to sit down with their lawyers, right, with a mediator in that sense who will help to facilitate an agreement, check out what are the outstanding issues between the parties, right? And the whole process is what we call without prejudice. It's confidential in the sense that whatever is said, discussed, whatever proposals which are made, documents which are exchanged at mediation cannot be used by either party if there's no agreement. The other main benefit, which is what a lot of Singaporeans would like to hear in that sense, is that if matters are resolved, and in a lot of cases, the matters are either substantially resolved, if not fully resolved at mediation.
So like, would you say 70-80%?
Yeah, 70-80% in that sense, right? And then if that is the case, right, a lot of time is saved, right? Because you don't need to go to court, argue out before a judge with regards to a contested hearing. And you save a lot of costs in terms of your legal fees, time spent attending to the divorce.
Less billable hours.
Less billable hours, maybe not so good for the lawyers, but we are always very happy for our clients when it's actually settled. I think the last point, which is also important, which I'd like to share, is that for clients going for mediation, we always say that that's the time when they're still in control of the process, right? Because yes, while you know, if you file for divorce and if you're not able to agree, the court has to decide. You will file all your affidavits to put in your evidence, right? And your lawyers will have to go in and argue. At the end of the day, if it's mediation, parties with the benefit of their lawyers who are sitting there giving them advice get to decide what works best for them and their children and their family in the whole. They can come up with solutions which are a bit more creative, right? Which if, for example, there's no agreement, the court has to make orders, would not make those kind of creative arrangements.
Understand. And it causes a lot less trauma to the kids. I think you mentioned that mediation. So in the mediation proceeding, the kids are not they don't need to attend.
Yeah, that's right. So generally speaking, in that sense, children are not involved in proceedings, and I would generally advise parties not to involve the children as far as possible, because at the end of the day, you want to shield them from the marital breakdown, right? It's already a stressful period of time in that sense. And the short answer is really, look, anything which reduces the level of animosity between the parties in that sense is good for the children, because children are very perceptive. First, already it's a lot of stress on the parents undergoing a difficult period of time, right? So the sooner they're able to resolve it, if they are able to resolve it sooner, there's less animosity involved. They're less likely to hurl, nasty accusations against each other, and then they're both able to move on their lives and the things that matter. Basically themselves and the children.
Okay. And when we had coffee earlier this year, you mentioned to me that there is this thing that's catching on called post-nup. So we've all heard of prenups. Post-nup is unusual, and you said that, Shulin, it's like a will or insurance. It used to be quite pantang, right? People wouldn't get it. But then now post-nups. But I was thinking to myself, I cannot imagine doing a post-nup with my husband. Does this only apply to high net worth individuals?
Okay, and the short answer to that, Shulin, is no. Actually, it's available for everyone. And maybe I think when we're having that coffee about post-nup, I was talking about certain category of post-nups where the marriage is still, fine, happy, well, intact, right? And in form and substance, these post-nups have a insurance kind of nature in the sense that when they enter, when a happy couple enter into a post-nup, assuming that there's no prenuptial agreement, right, they're not hoping for a breakdown of the marriage. In fact, it's very clear usually in such post-nups, they say that they hope that the marriage doesn't break down, but in the unfortunate event of a divorce, in that sense, this is how they've agreed to settle their finances. But actually, post-nups are not that uncommon. They've been around longer than prenups. Why do I say that? Because there are two other categories where actually post-nups are quite widely utilized. And there are two stages of the marriage, right? The second stage is where basically the marriage, unfortunately, is already breaking down. It's an unhappy marriage and parties have decided to separate. So in this form, a postnup usually takes the context of what we usually call a separation deed, right? Where it basically, a postnuptial agreement sets in stone, in that sense, parties' agreement in terms of how they want to live their separate lives, and where possible, and especially where the children of the marriage, record an agreement on the financial matters, on the parenting issues. The last stage, which is also quite common in that sense, is where, marriage has already broken down, parties have filed for divorce. Sometimes in that sense, right, the postnuptial agreement is recorded at this stage, right? If there are already divorce proceedings which are ongoing, right, then it can be recorded as a part of consent order, or can be made in anticipation of divorce proceedings being filed shortly thereafter.
I see. So I was thinking more in the context of a happy marriage.
Yes.
I cannot imagine any couple saying, hey, let's go to Ivan. Let's do like a post-nup as insurance in case our marriage doesn't work out.
Correct.
But you have situations like
yes,
that.
so
maybe it's just fintech billionaires.
No. This is not a case. So it will be the same conversation. So in that kind of context where it's a happy marriage, it will be the similar situation for couples who, in that sense, enter to a prenuptial agreement. Why do they enter to a prenuptial agreement? And the overarching theme really is that of, not of asset protection, but because they both value the kind of certainty that agreement would be able to give, right, in the unfortunate event in that sense. So if you compare to insurance, right, like comprehensive life insurance, you hope you don't need to rely on it, but touch wood, in the unfortunate event this happens, yes, you don't have that kind of uncertainty. You will be able to avoid all this kind of animosity about,
But death
grief.
is certain.
Death is certain.
Hopefully a breakdown of marriage is not certain.
Correct.
You know what I mean?
That's so same thing. Like, so it's like, the only difference about life insurance is that yes, death is certain. Yes, there'll be a payout. But if you're talking about like say this kind of critical,
fine,
in that sense, right?
Okay,
and
your insurance.
No, and sometimes it can be also a bit more limited in the sense that it does not necessarily mean that postnup must always cover, like, say, how are we going to settle the assets in the event of a divorce? Sometimes it gives that kind of certainty. For example, if a spouse is going to come into is going to receive a significant amount of family inheritance, or right, in terms of the family assets or family shares, and then they want to give their family that kind of assurance to say that, don't worry, these assets are still going to remain in the family, right? So I'm going to have a fair discussion with my spouse. So it can be more limited one in that sense.
That makes sense. If it doesn't form part of the matrimonial assets to begin
exclude
with,
it.
right? Okay, so then my question is, if one of the listeners out there thinks that their marriage might not be working out, if they have a friend, what do you do? So what's the first thing to do? You protect your assets? You call a lawyer? See a marriage counselor? Or all of the above?
And so I'm going to give a very lawyer's response to that. Is that it will depend on the circumstances. Like, so the first question I'll ask is it what is the state of the marriage, in the sense that, is it a physically abusive marriage? Is the party in that sense subject to physical abuse, imminent physical threat? So if it's a situation like that, the first advice will be, please go and get help for yourself in that sense. Make a police report, get a personal protection order to restrain the other party from committing family violence. Of course, in that aspect, you won't need to see a family lawyer. But if it's a case in that sense where the marriage breaking down is not due to like physical violence or abuse, right, then what I always tell my clients is it's important in that sense, right, for you to get your necessary support system, right? Be it speaking to family, speaking to friends in that sense. And generally it's a very stressful period of their life, right? We'll say, there's no shame in that sense in going to speak to a professional counselor. It might not be a marriage counselor first, right? Because they might need to know their options moving forward. And then if they feel that they're able to sit down and talk it through with their spouse, right, with the professional support, please do that. Sit down, talk it through, go for marriage counseling. And then, yes, please do go and see a family lawyer, right?
Yeah, maybe Ivan.
I'll say the it shouldn't be a first response to want to protect your assets.
Yes, of course. Yeah, it shouldn't be. But I remember when I was attending in NUS Law, we were both from NUS Law, and there was a family law module. When the professor started talking about protection of matrimonial assets, everyone sat up and started paying attention.
Yes, that's right. So it's a typical thing, because these are, I wouldn't say it's a life skill in that sense, but this is something which you want to know in that sense, that how to protect yourself in the unfortunate event, right?
So how?
That something happens.
How? How to protect?
Short answer is it depends on the facts of the case, right? Because like I said, while you're looking at how to protect assets, if the marriage has already broken down, it's not a case about like say, I try to park assets away with my mom, my relatives.
And you can trace it anyway,
It can be traced anyway. So the legal system is very robust in that sense. Our laws are very sound, right? So if you're thinking that, you know what, I'm gonna get a divorce shortly after, in the meantime I'll clear all the bank accounts and nothing's going to be divided, I'm sorry to say that that's not likely to work, right? But check in that sense with a family lawyer to see options.
Okay, so Ivan, let's talk about the high-profile cases, some of them that you have done. So you acted for a single homosexual father, and he had to appeal because he wanted to adopt his own kid that was born by a surrogate mother. And luckily he succeeded, so congratulations on a good result. So you were interviewed on radio, national newspapers, and international media about that. Could you share a bit more about your, how the case was, your comments on the whole thing?
I think without going too much into the confidential details in that sense, I think this was a situation whereby basically my client, the father, really just wanted, in that sense, to be able to adopt his own biological son, right? To provide, not to challenge the social norms, in that sense, that's never been his view, but to be able, in that sense, for the child to be able to reside in Singapore. And so at the end of the day, we were very heartened that the court agreed and allowed his adoption application on the basis that, look, it's in the child's best interest. So in this regard, right, while there are all these kind of very new norms in that sense, right, are these issues of surrogacy, some of which has still not been addressed yet in that sense, right? I think going from the angle that we're not here to make a very groundbreaking decision, we are really looking at what is in this child's best interest. And it's in the child's best interest to be able, in that sense, to live in Singapore, in that sense, with his father, right, with father, the extended family, the support network, because this is where, in that sense, this is the home, in that sense, right? This is a place which a child calls home. So I think these are some of the issues, and we have seen in that sense, right, from this case, how that has also given rise, in that sense, to certain discussions in Parliament with regards to the role of a family, and of course our government's professed, desire to support, parenthood within planned marriage between a man and a woman, in that sense. So these are some of the lasting impacts and ground-reaching kind of consequences which have actually resulted from there.
That was the first of its kind, right?
That was the first reported contested adoption in which basically it was allowed on appeal, and I think our client was really very grateful for that. And I mean, that is also in tandem with, of course, what has always been ongoing regards to the challenges, right, to Section 377A, which now we have seen, right?
Yes, and that's my next question. Because now with Section 377A being repealed, what was your immediate thought when you heard the news?
I think so. Maybe clarify in that sense. I think when it was first reported in August, right, 2022, that the government would be repealing Section 377A, I would say that I frankly was my first thought was about time in that sense. I was happy, but I was also pleasantly surprised because I didn't really expect it to be that fast in that sense. I think perhaps all these things working in tandem, right, all the cases which have been brought up before the courts have highlighted basically the need to say that can we still continue to maintain this kind of approach, which was the position which was taken, I think, the last parliamentary debate sometime in 2007, where it was determined, or the position was to say that 377A would remain on the books, but it will not be enforced, in that sense. And then the ongoing question was like, say, if it's not going to be enforced, right, why leave it on our statute books, right, in that sense, right? Surely, if you're talking about, and Singapore still, right, we are still a very conservative nation with our social norms and wanting to encourage, in that sense, right, a conventional family unit, right, in that sense, these can still remain, right? But there's no need, in that sense, to have what I would say is a bad and discriminatory law, which basically penalizes a significant segment of society just for being who they are.
It does. I mean, I really like Lady Gaga. So Lady Gaga has this song called Born This Way, right? And I had lunch with a friend whom I've known for years. And it took the repeal of Section 377A for him to finally come out to me.
Oh.
Yeah. And now we have a real, authentic friendship. And he told me, you know what, Shulin, when I discovered I was gay at the age of 14, I knew about 377A and I was terrified. I'm seen as a potential criminal, basically. Yeah. And the thing is, being me, the cynical me, I thought, oh, what's the big deal? It was not enforced, so it's repealed. So what does it mean? But when I had that lunch with him, I felt, wow, it's actually very significant.
It is, because like I said, I mean, it's one thing to say that, we are not gonna enforce it, no one's gonna police the bedroom activities of two consenting adults. It's another, in that sense, to leave basically a law on our statute books which essentially, however you look at it, criminalizes the conduct of a significant segment of society. And the question really is, what is the signal in which we are sending, in that sense, to, I mean, like I said, it's one thing to promote, right? Parenthood within marriage is one thing to promote like good family norms, right? But to say that, you know what, because we are conservative society, we're not ready in that sense for alternative lifestyles, as they like to phrase it in that sense. Therefore, we need to continue to have this kind of Section 377A in the books. And I think, I mean, I can share also, I mean, with friends and all that, some of them really felt very liberated, because they say, it's so long, and I mean, you have all the like ongoing like social movements like Pink Dot and all that, right? Which is something which is held every year, right? The question really is like, say, why do we continue to allow this to remain? Because regardless, even if you say you don't enforce it, you are sending the signal to say that, you know what, whatever you're doing is not condoned, right? It can even subject you in that sense to the specter of criminal prosecution.
Yes.
Right? So but it's good that that's out of the picture.
It's true. So some people, I've seen like social media, varying opinions. So some people say that, okay, great, one step forward, but is it 10 steps back? Because now that they've changed the constitution to make it such that no case law can ever challenge that the institution of marriage needs to be between a man and a woman, it actually is quite discouraging. What do you think is does the future hold for this?
I don't have a crystal ball, and of course the answer would be, at the end of the day, it will be up to the future parliaments to decide, right, regards to the definition of marriage and how we're going to move forward from here. I think, and I see the point really, and to be fair, that's also a bit of my concern, right? I mean, with the introduction of Article 156 of the Constitution, which basically says that, the current definition of marriage will be defined by Parliament and cannot be challenged by courts, essentially, in that sense. It doesn't codify marriage as a constitution, as an institution in the Constitution, and I think that's very sound in that sense. But essentially what we see is we are seeing an entrenchment of the status quo. And sometimes the question also is, with these policies which are being enacted, how then does it impact these the LGBTQ community in that sense, right? Because if you're just talking about cases whereby they're families, right, there could be certain real impact on the children in that sense, right, in regards to like schooling, residence, so on and so forth, right? So it really remains to be seen. And I think that's a concern on the ground, that some of them feel that it's great that Section 377A has been repealed. But then does it mean in that sense things are going to be harder for us now? Because sometimes that is the anecdotal evidence on the ground to say it's harder in that sense for us to get certain kind of residential pass or passes in that sense for our children.
Even like emergency contact, apparently it has to be a family member, it can't be your partner. And I think at the heart of it, I really like what you said about the contested adoption. What's in the best interest of the children, if there are children involved? I think we have to look at it from that lens. Hey, so Ivan, now that we've talked about, some of the cases, what are some of the changes you would love to see in our family legal regime?
Okay, well, in terms of the changes, first I would like to share that in the recent years, right, as I was saying earlier, the move towards therapeutic justice to make the family system less adversarial in that sense for parties who are going to undergoing a divorce as well as the children, to reduce the element of conflict. I think that's been a positive change, right? And we are still going to go forward with that, right? So I think that's something which is great. What I would like to see a bit more of in that sense is really to focus on the children in that sense. And when I'm talking about children, I'm not saying that that's not the focus now. It is a focus, but I'm also talking about the fact that you're looking at children from all kinds of families, right? And earlier we were talking about the government's planned preferred policy of parenthood within a marriage, conventional marriage as defined in that sense. But we all know that, life is not so simple. Life is not perfect. There are many kinds of families these days, and there are children in all of these kind of families, right? And so, of course, where there are families, sometimes there are disputes or there are issues affecting the children, like, their residential status, parenting arrangements, if the children in that sense, right, would like to leave Singapore, right, for a different country, and there are certain disputes, right? What then should the approach, which perhaps our courts would take, right? And I'm hoping in that sense that, when we are looking at these issues, the focus would really just be on, okay, what is in this child's best interest, without all that kind of additional side noise about, is this in line with the government's policy of parenthood within marriage, or that, right? So don't tiptoe around these issues sensitive. Just take it by the horns and be prepared to say, like, what, if it's a case whereby I think certain orders need to be made in the children's best interest in that sense, let's have those orders made.
Interesting. And you're right, because, putting aside the rights of homosexuals, even heterosexuals have different family units now.
You have like single parents in that sense, right? Or parties who have been, living together for a long time, but they're never married, right? In that sense, right? Arguably, if it's in that kind of context, it might still be easier in that sense for certain parenting orders to be made, right? But at the same time, it doesn't take into consideration the reality of the modern family unit. So, for example, if there are cohabitation agreements in place in that sense, how should we deal with it, right? Right now, and I'll just say very candidly, it's not covered under law, right? So perhaps that's something in that sense which will need to be considered, and of course, that will be within the purview of Parliament.
So before we move on to the next segment, I just thought of something, because not everyone has kids. What if it's dogs and cats? Have you had situations where...
So actually in other jurisdictions, this is a point which has come out, and when they're talking about prenuptial, there's a special thing called pet nuptial in that sense,
really?
Right?
Pet nuptial?
But certainly in my years of practice, I've had a couple cases where, the parties don't have kids, right? They're pets, right?
And the pets are like their children?
Yes, they are like their children, which is understandable. But what they then try to do is to ask in that sense for the equivalent of parenting orders for these pets in that sense. And the short answer is, well, in Singapore, unfortunately,
so excess
the courts don't have, we're talking about custody and all that, right? It's the courts have that kind of power because you're talking about children. But and it sounds very cruel, but if you're looking at pets, right, that pets are effectively considered as what we call chattel, objects, right?
Chattel.
So usually the courts won't make orders as far as the pets are
Then what do you do?
So
if both parties want the dog.
If both parties, so that's why we encourage,
mediation.
as part of mediation and that sense.
But how to mediate? Like, both parties want the dog desperately.
So in that kind of situation, right, like either they reach an agreement between themselves, right, or something has to give, right? There's no easy answer for
cash.
that. Like cold hard cash, or like having some kind of arrangements between themselves to say that I'll spend a certain amount of time in that sense. But unfortunately, these can't be reflected as part of the court order.
So maybe animal lovers will want to see legislation, or they have to do pet nuptials.
Yeah, but even then, pet nuptials in Singapore would not really be valid.
Right. Okay. So now let's talk about you, the family lawyer. You've given us a snapshot of how it's like to be you and what you have to grapple with. I'm very curious, I'm sure you get this all the time. How do you do it? You see kids crying, spouses turn ugly on each other, and it must make you wonder if marriage is even worth it. Are you jaded?
And the short answer, that's a very common question I get as a family lawyer. essentially it's no, right? Because why? You know, I've got a lot of friends who are family lawyers and all that. A lot of wonderful family lawyers who are happily married in that sense, right? And so if you allow yourself to be disillusioned, of course, there's a common saying, you know, criminal lawyers in that sense see the best in bad people, whereas divorce or family lawyers see the worst in good people. There's a nugget of truth to that, right? But that said, I think the professional aspect of it is that at most, right, from our lens, we might be, if we hear of certain misconduct, we might come to certain conclusions. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we view relationships. I don't view relationships very cynically, right? If anything, you can say that, oh, these are some of the learning points which you can know and you should apply in that sense to your life, right? But at the end of the day, I think it's about the need, right, to have that kind of passion and aptitude for what you do. Certainly in that sense, if I didn't find what I was doing meaningful, I don't think I'll be in practice now.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you are a very successful lawyer and you find fulfillment in your work. Have you seen a marriage, a troubled marriage, right? Maybe the couple, they are in the midst of a divorce settlement, but they end up reconciling. Have you ever seen that?
Yes, while not common in that sense, right? I have seen that. There were a few cases in that sense where parties actually filed for divorce, and then, you know, even after the interim judgment has been granted, then they decide to reconcile, right? For various reasons. Either they try to work things through, and then they apply in that sense to withdraw the divorce proceedings. So, and I'm always very, very happy for clients when it happens and it's successful. I think I can even share that. I mean, there was one case whereby, you know, the divorce was also granted. And then a few years later, they remarried. And they're still happily together in that sense. So short answer is never say never.
Yes.
In that sense, it does happen.
Yes.
So family law and divorce work is not always necessarily all doom and gloom. Yes, a large part is with regards to helping parties to move on from an unhappy marriage. But there are areas also which are, you know, very positive in that sense.
And actually, why do you choose to go into family law of all the areas of law?
Are we candid? I think and I didn't even do family law in NUS in that sense.
What?
It's just on the module. Yeah, you know, right? Because I was told in that sense, take it when I was in year 4.
I
then
did
after
it.
that, you know, right? I was told that's one of the better modules to take,
score an
right?
A. Yes.
So anyway, like I said, when I started out, it was not really my intention, right? When I was training under what was then known as pupil master, right? I think now your mentor, right? My pupil master basically only did civil and commercial litigation, so I thought that's what I would be doing, right? But shortly after, shortly before I was called, right, at my first firm in that sense, the partner who used to be doing family work in that sense left along with the associate. So the senior partner who was tasked to take over a portfolio basically told me and my colleague, you know what, just do it. It's good court exposure, good experience. And I didn't know that I would actually enjoy it. You know, I came in and I had that kind of, you know, I think that kind of layman view, like say, oh, why do all this kind of work where you know, you're talking about people divorcing, so unhappy. How's it meaningful? But I found that, you know, when I started, I found that, you know, hey, these are people's lives which you're talking about. Yes, the subject matter is not pleasant, but being able to help them, and I found that, you know, being able to understand and empathize with them was one thing which is important. The second one is not allowing yourself to be impacted by it, because like I said, I think this is a very important point. Once you do, you're not going to be you're not going to be able to, you know, continue in this area of law. So it was started out accidental in that sense, but I found it was actually very meaningful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's the most enjoyable part about your work?
I think that what I enjoy a lot is first being able to meet my clients. Of course, when they come to see me in that sense, most of them are extremely unhappy, and understandably so, because it's not a happy point of their life in that sense, right? What I enjoy is being able to, you know, come up with solutions for them, right? Try to reassure them, it's also not just about just going to court and argue, right? You are there in that sense. I feel I'm there to be able to help clients and make an impact in their lives, because like I said, when you're able to help them to move on, right, present the options to them, and it actually works out in that sense, right? That's when you see and you find it being very meaningful. So I think for me, that's what I find the kind of joy in, right? Being able to assist clients. I know it might sound very cliche, but it's actually not, right? Because I said you could be, I mean, I could have like chosen another area of law, and I think just to caveat, I think everyone, I mean, regardless of the area of law in which you practice in, it is important in that sense, right? But at the same time, not every area of law is suited for everyone.
Yes.
Like, I'll be very candid, is I don't think I can do criminal law in that sense for reasons which I think I've shared with some of my colleagues.
Neither can I. I tried. But I think what I really get from you in all our conversations is your heart, you know? Like, you did share with me before, we had a candid conversation about how there are, let's face it, there are divorce lawyers, there are lawyers who are really more in it for the billables, and they will really rack up like a really big legal bill when it's really not necessary. It might not be in the best interest of the clients.
Definitely.
And I think that's very, very important, because I was a lawyer.
Yep.
I work with lawyers every day, and it was only in recent years that I realized, because I had some friends who had legal troubles, one was going through a divorce, then I realized how important it is to have a lawyer who's really acting in your best interest, not in his best interest, not in his wallet's best interest.
Correct.
Yeah,
that's right.
you know.
So,
I mean, we all are in it. Obviously, we want to earn a good living.
It is at the end of the day business in that sense, and I think that's a very valid point. So, you know, like when you're talking earlier about mediation, right? The short answer is you know, if the matter gets resolved sooner and quicker, is it good for the lawyers, right? I mean, if you want to look at it cynically, no, it's not so good, because why? It means that the amount of
you don't get to go to
you
trial.
can bill in that sense will not be so much, right? But I always think that's a wrong way of looking at it, because like I said, at the end of the day, right, it's about what you can do for your client, how you can assist your client. And certainly in areas of practice like mine, where we have very few repeat clients, you have no institutional clients.
Very few repeat
clients in that sense. What you do with your client, and if a client is happy and satisfied, and knows that you are working in that sense for your client's best interest to try and reach a resolution that addresses your client's concern, and not there to, like, you know, just churn litigation or like just go to trial in that sense. I think clients understand and appreciate that, and when they're happy, they will also, you know, make the appropriate recommendations.
For sure. So you definitely, clearly, you find your work fulfilling. Do you see more or less lawyers wanting to do family law? Because I know you have a couple of young lawyers who work for you. Just, you know, for the young lawyers or the aspiring lawyers out there listening to this, what will you say to them? You know, what do you think are some important values to have if they want to be doing what you do?
I think, so for your first question, I think that there are actually more and more young lawyers who are coming in who want to, you know, contribute or practice an area which they feel is more meaningful. Again, like I said, I'm not saying that all other areas are not mean, they are. Okay.
Don't worry.
But yes, short answer is actually we are seeing a lot of younger lawyers who are choosing family law in that sense, and that's very heartening. Family law, community law, criminal law, and that's just because they feel that's how they can contribute back in that sense to society. And my advice to anyone who's thinking of being a family lawyer or being a lawyer in general is be true to yourself in that sense, right? I think what is important is that they need to have that kind of passion for their chosen area, but they also in that sense need to take care of their mental health, their mental well-being, because I said if you're not in the right frame of mind, and when I say not in the right frame of mind, it doesn't mean in that sense that there's some mental condition, but just if you're like so overworked, or you're so tired, or you're not able in the sense to give your best, how then are you able to help your client? So I think that's important. And of course, the second thing, which is very important, is try not to make shortcuts. I think integrity is very important, right?
Absolutely.
So at the end of the day, it's not about, like, say, trying to win a case at all costs. That should never be the case. Have your values, stick to it, and be principled. And at the end of the day, always remember, always an officer of the court. Integrity is key.
Yes. So Ivan, you are always so energetic, and there's a lot of passion and vigor. How do you maintain how do you protect your mental well-being? You said mental wellness.
Yeah, that's right. So, well, I mean, of course, a large part of it is having coffee in the morning. So I'm able to actually get started. But jokes aside, I think being able in that sense to have time for yourself, right? Be it whatever is it you enjoy. Like for myself, I'll set aside time in that sense for family and friends, right? I enjoy cooking in that sense, right? Maybe because I'm a bit of a glutton, I like my food in that sense, right? But I find it's relaxing. So have time away from work. And when I say have time away from work, in the sense that when it's time to work, give yourself 110% in that sense to work. Focus on work, but have some clear demarcations in that sense. So when it's time in that sense to take a break, don't go back, just keep on thinking about the case, because if you do that, you don't really have that clear demarcation. And sometimes it's good just to have some alone time in that sense, if necessary, to actually have some digital detox and like de-stress in that sense. I think that's important.
Yeah, it's very important. So what's one piece of advice you wish you were given when you were first starting out as a young lawyer?
I think well, the advice which I would like to give myself is that, life is short, right? Work hard and be prepared to make mistakes, and more importantly, learn from them in that sense,
bounce back.
Yeah, bounce back, and if you need help, don't be afraid to ask. And when I say need help, it doesn't just mean in terms of work, but if you feel like you're burnt out for whatever reason, right? Don't feel that you need to keep it in, because I think the general perception, certainly when I was starting as a younger lawyer, is we need to put in our time, we need to put in our hours, and there's no such thing as a work-life balance and all that. I mean, these are some of the good things which, I mean, if you're talking about a good working ethos, right, that's still in place, right? But it also doesn't mean that you have to forsake your well-being, and don't be afraid in that sense, right, to ask if you need help. If you're making a mistake for whatever reason, be prepared to own up, right? But then, of course, learn from your mistakes.
Okay, yes. And I always believe we are not defined by our mistakes.
That's right.
But we are defined by how we bounce back, whether we bounce back.
That's right.
Don't just give up, right?
Yes.
And to everyone out there who wants to stay married happily and not have to come knocking on your door, what's one piece of advice you give to them?
Well, I'm not a marriage counselor, but I think just to share, and I think that's something which has worked. And I mean, clients have also shared is what I've called, it sounds a bit cliche, but the 3 C's, okay, which it would be communicate, right? Compromise and commitment, right? These are very important for a successful marriage.
Or any relationship for that matter.
Yes, that's right. Any relationship. So you must be able to communicate with your other half in that sense. If there are problems, right, it's not just communicate when they're good times, right? Yes. Especially when they're bad times, right? Don't just keep it all in, sweep it under the rug. Because the chances, if you don't address it, right, or you just say, I'm just going to park it aside, because even if I talk about it, right, I'm sure my spouse or my other half won't care, it's going to fester, right? And these things will just develop over time. So that's communication, that's key. Compromise, like in any relationship or that, nothing's going to be perfect. We don't live in a perfect world,
like
right?
We have
seat.
Just gotta let it go.
First, they might need to communicate about their unhappiness cuts to the toilet seat first, and then see where they can compromise. In that sense, for example, it could be like, oh, you know what? I'll clean the toilet more frequently, something to that effect. But it's never going to be always your way. If you're going to take your way or highway kind of attitude, that's going to be extremely difficult. The last one, of course, is commitment, which is, I think, very important because, like I said, it takes an effort to remain committed to each other. And usually in that sense, as relationships and marriages grow, or with the length of time, they evolve. Nothing remains static. It's never going to be the usual like romantic lovey-dovey kind of initial phrase, right? But the whole idea is how, as a couple, in that sense, you'll grow together, and when things arise in that sense, how you'll deal with it together. And that is usually, I think, something which is important.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. We've heard so much from Ivan, the family lawyer. So before we wrap up the podcast, we like to switch it up and get personal to find out more about you. So the rapid fire round of questions.
Sure.
Okay, so what are the 3 words you use to describe yourself?
Passionate, loyal, intense.
Ooh, that's why we're friends. Okay. Night owl or morning bird?
Night owl.
Oh, favorite color?
Blue or red? I think they're both
blue or
equal.
red. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm
No,
not
it's
dressed
fine.
in blue or red. Favorite music genre?
Pop.
Pop, what, like Britney Spears?
Well, she used to be on
Yes.
my list
Yeah,
last
me too.
time. Yeah, okay.
What is your go-to comfort food?
Well, probably chocolate.
Same. Okay, what is the first thing that comes to mind when I say bar?
Wine.
Wine. What kind of wine?
Red.
Oh, nice. Okay. Thank you, Ivan, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Shulin.
I'm sure some of the guests out there will work harder at keeping their marriages going. Maybe employ the 3 Cs, and who knows, maybe one of them will join you and be a family law lawyer.
Yeah, maybe.
So if you've enjoyed this podcast, then be generous and share with all of your friends. Rate it, review it, and follow me on LinkedIn. If you can go on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to give us 5 stars, I'll be very grateful. And join us next time to find out what's in store for us after the bar. Bye!
Bye.